Good afternoon and welcome to the October 2020 version of Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. My name is Franco Montalto. I'm a professor here at Drexel University, and we're glad you could join us for today's seminar. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this seminar series is monthly. We've been doing it back since 2014 on the first Wednesday of every month. There are usually 2 to 6, in this case, speakers each month. If you're interested in any of the previous seminars that we've held, they're all archived because this is webcast as well as recorded and saved on the ccrun.org website. For those of you who haven't been to the CCRun website in a while, we've updated it, and it's a very good indexing of previous presentations there. You can interact with the panelists through the Q&A box. You can interact in different ways. You can submit questions, you can comment on questions, you can upvote questions. The chat function is only for comments, so do not put your questions for the panelists in the chat function. It's more, if you're having trouble with connections or whatever and you want to talk to us. A little bit of context on today's seminar. And this is speaking to the Drexel community. Drexel is ramping up its climate-focused activities, both at Drexel and the Academy of Natural Sciences. And we were heartened to see at last week's convocation, President John Fry talk about the unprecedented climate disasters that we're seeing. Provost of Drexel talked about some climate and sustainability initiatives that are in the works and will be announced soon. As we speak, the College of Engineering is having its State of the College meeting, and unfortunately we're missing it, but during that presentation, our Dean, Sharon Walker, is going to be talking about the fact that sustainability and climate will be one of the 4 initiatives built into our new strategic plan, both from a pedagogy and operations standpoint. The Academy of Natural Sciences, Scott Cooper, our CEO, is marshaling in a full suite of public programming for the next year that's focusing on climate change and sustainability. And so we invite you to stay tuned for, if you're a student, climate change focused classes, if you're a member of the public, events, not only this one, but events at the Academy of Natural Sciences. And all of our viewers are invited to keep a lookout for this cross-sector convening of climate change stakeholders that we'll be holding in the spring, with further details forthcoming. And that is really sort of this suite of activities that we're very excited. And I'll just, as we go into today's event, talk a little bit about the motivating questions as we at the university think about climate change and how to best respond. We're asking ourselves questions about the role that universities can play in advancing climate policies. What are best practices for integrating climate change topics into curriculum? And how can university researchers be part of the process of coming up with municipal decisions that advance climate change preparedness? And then finally, and probably most importantly, how do we prepare our students, regardless of whatever their home department is here, to be part of the solution? So in this context and with these motivating questions, we put together a really exciting seminar today, sort of trying to bring to Philadelphia lessons of ongoing collaborations for climate resilience in the cities of Boston, Pittsburgh, and New York cities. And so the speakers today include 3 representatives of the 3 cities. Adam Paris is the Deputy Director of Climate Science and Risk Communication at the Mayor's Office of Resiliency in New York. And he's a nationally recognized leader working with scientists, governments, and communities to advance resilience. We have Grant Irvin, who is the Chief Resiliency Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning for the City of Pittsburgh. And there he oversees the integration of sustainability and resilience into city services, programs, and policy. And Carl Spector, who is the Environment Commissioner, oversees programs related to climate mitigation and adaptation, environmental protection, historic preservation, and other aspects of sustainability. He's led the development and implementation of Boston's ongoing climate mitigation and adaptation plans, starting with its first plan back in 2007. So we'll have introductory presentations by our 3 city representatives talking about methodologically how they've worked, how they've developed their programs, and how they've interacted in particular with various stakeholders, including universities. And then we'll move into a panel discussion that's moderated by Salim Chapman and Julia Rockwell. So Salim was recently appointed to serve as Philadelphia's first Chief Resiliency Officer, where he will be overseeing the creation and implementation of a citywide climate preparedness and resilience strategy for the city of Philadelphia. So that's very exciting. Julia Rockwell is a water resources management professional with the Philadelphia Water Department, where she has served as a project engineer on the city's nationally recognized source water protection program. And she's also led the development of a new department-wide capital planning process and initiated the development and implementation of the department's climate change adaptation program. So Salim and Julia will moderate the discussion, including the city reps and our 3 academic reps. And these 3 academic reps are in the 3 cities represented by Adam, Grant, and Carl. So Dr. Bill Selecki, who is my co-PI at CC Run, is a professor within the Department of Geography at Hunter College, City University of New York. And he's co-led several climate impact studies in the greater New York and New Jersey region, including the New York City panel on climate change. Dr. Aurora Sherrard is the Director of Sustainability at the University of Pittsburgh, where she is tasked with enabling the Pitt Sustainability Plan, which formalizes decades of university-led and partnered initiatives at the intersection of equity, environment, and economics. And finally, Dr. Paul Kirshen, who's a professor of climate adaptation in the University of Massachusetts Boston School for the Environment. And his experience is in complex interdisciplinary research related to water resources and climate variability and change. So with that, I will hand over the presentation to our city speakers. I will stop sharing.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking Drexel for hosting us this afternoon. I'm incredibly excited by the year of climate action that you're kicking off today. I also want to express my gratitude to my fellow panelists for being so gracious with their time and wisdom. I cannot underscore enough how fortunate Philadelphia is to have this opportunity to learn from cities that have really been at the vanguard of this work. New York, Boston, and Pittsburgh, despite having each taken unique approaches, have maximized the collaborations needed to deliver compelling resilience visions. I'm thrilled that we'll have the opportunity to study their experiences and build on their tremendous success. Philadelphia enters an exciting new phase in its quest to become a more resilient, equitable city for not only the residents of today, but for generations to come. And while for most of this afternoon, our focus will be on the promise of efforts that lie ahead, I'll be remiss if I did not acknowledge the forward thinking, collaborations, and hard work that have been essential to getting us to this point. We could have not arrived at this moment if not for the foundational elements put in place by years of groundwork, the roots of which extend as far back as 2012, because it was that year that Philadelphia took its first steps to prepare for the impacts of climate change when it convened an interagency working group on climate adaptation. This group collaborated to produce the first set of Philadelphia-specific climate projections that suggested that the city's new normal would be both warmer and wetter. Furthermore, those projections indicated that we will experience this weather in more extremes, with heat waves, intense rainfall events, snowstorms, and hurricanes all becoming more frequent and severe. The efforts of that interagency working group continued into 2015 and resulted in the publication of Growing Stronger Towards a Climate-Ready Philadelphia. Growing Stronger is Philadelphia's first climate adaptation plan, and it focuses on how to preserve government operations and service delivery under future climate conditions. Following Growing Stronger, scaling efforts beyond municipal operations became our central focus. And in 2018, led by the Office of Sustainability, Philadelphia piloted place-based climate adaptation planning with a focus on heat in a high-risk neighborhood. This pilot was grounded in the idea that neighborhoods will not experience climate impacts equally, and as a result, specific communities will need a concerted effort to reduce the unique risks that they confront. A year later, that work accumulated and beat the heat high in Park, a community heat relief program which identified neighborhood-scale interventions to reduce the urban heat island. Not long after the release of that plan, Philadelphia began to scope a citywide adaptation planning process. This scoping project considered how Philadelphia should approach unifying existing initiative and bridging the remaining gaps. This process involved a series of conversations with internal and external stakeholders. It also involved a review of good principles and best practices from around the country, including many of those represented on this panel today. It was based on the findings from this effort that Mayor Kenney made his determination that climate adaptation was to be a key priority of his second term. And that development of a resilience strategy will be best served by the establishment of a Chief Resiliency Officer position, a position that I was recently appointed 2 weeks ago. But I will also note that these major milestones was the result of numerous innovations and partnerships, such as the creation of a climate change adaptation program within the Philadelphia Water Department, or the formation of task forces on flood mitigation and heat resiliency, in addition to others that are just too many in number to name. There is definitely a common thread between all of these efforts, even down to the very construction of this panel, and it is that they mirror our core belief that driving urban resilience will take more than one position, one agency, one sector, or even one city. It is only through our collective effort that we will meet the scale of this unprecedented crisis. And so with that, I am extremely eager to hear how Philadelphia can begin to do its part. And so I'll turn it over to my colleagues in New York to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Salim. It's great to be here. Great to be alongside all of these esteemed panelists, colleagues from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Boston. We have always learned from our friends in the Northeast Corridor and continue, to your point, to want to learn more and propel each other forward to a more resilient Northeastern US. So I guess I was asked to set the stage a little bit by talking a little bit about the structural sort of trajectory of the climate work in New York City, but also kind of relay that journey through a narrative perspective. So I'll talk a little bit about the structure first. It really started, well, I will start. I'll channel my fellow New York City colleague, Bill Selecki, in saying that, you know, many different people have many different origin stories. But I think from a structural perspective, it started in the Bloomberg administration within the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, thinking about, you know, a strong response to climate change. And a part of that was forming the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which formed in 2008 and then came out with its first assessment in 2010. Moving forward quickly, the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability split and had a sister office, the Office of Recovery and Resiliency, in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And then eventually, those two offices split again or reorganized again into the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, Climate Policies and Programs, and the office I'm a part of, the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Shortly after the first New York City Panel on Climate Change Assessment, the City Council passed a law that essentially codified and institutionalized the New York City Panel on Climate Change. That was Local Law 42 of 2012. It called for NPCC to continue to produce assessments and be the primary scientific advisory body to the mayor and to city council with respect to near and long-term climate, past, present, and future, with respect to the impacts of climate on all of the different working parts of the city, from critical infrastructure to parks and open space, to transportation, to people in neighborhoods and communities. A part of that, acknowledging those different working parts of the city, was to also, in that same law, form the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. And so NPCC and the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force are sort of linked advisory bodies. The Climate Change Adaptation Task Force are all the managers and operators of those different systems, both public and private. So some of the entities are city agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection, and some of them are private, like Con Edison. We have had a stronger focus on critical infrastructure and health, and are continuing to expand and meet, really sort of address the full range of things thought about in the context of the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. More recently, now we have another advisory body that is a really important part of the city's climate response. That is the Environmental Justice Advisory Board. It's made up of different external partners, environmental justice organizations, and academic institutions, with a charge to, a complementary charge really to NPCC, to identify environmental justice communities, make that information publicly available, as well as start to point the way towards plans for how to address environmental justice. So there's a lot of different organizational parts to that. It's beyond the bureaucratic elements. I think what you can take away are a few important things. First of all, there has always been support from the mayor's office. So from the top level of city government over the past decade, from that 2008, 2010 timeframe to 2020, there has always been support from the top level of city government, both the mayor and city council. The second thing you can take away from that is that we've expanded and adjusted our structure to give adequate attention to mitigation and sustainability. First off, second off, resiliency and adaptation. And then third, new strategic initiatives. So we're being flexible and adjusting along the way. The final thing that you can take away from that is that we have taken seriously more recently the calls for transformation and equity, even if we're still working to fully realize what a just, equitable, and resilient city looks like. So that's actually a good point to sort of quickly tackle that same history from a narrative perspective. I think the early days were a lot about adaptive risk management. NPCC's first report touched on flexible adaptation pathways, sort of inflection points where within the limits of tolerable risk, and how transformations play out. And I think that reflects a very large role from science and from government. There was very clearly an inflection point obviously in Hurricane Sandy, which tragically impacted all of our cities and states, and where rebuilding and recovery were the imperative, largely driven by federal stimulus dollars. And those federal stimulus dollars, not only did the mayor come out forcefully and say we would rebuild, but those federal stimulus dollars, even to this day, play a pretty important role in that they were largely geared towards rebuilding and getting back to pre-Sandy, while also trying to build stronger and more resilient, as is evidenced in the special initiative on rebuilding and resiliency. So even before COVID-19, but especially with the pandemic, we're in the middle now of a transformation where the goals, aspirations, and values of New Yorkers can and certainly should play a larger role, especially with communities who have been excluded from resources and opportunities. Equity needs to be the transformation, the next transformation point, and that's about not just bouncing back to the way things were, but actually improving the status quo and quality of life for New Yorkers. Science isn't lost in that mix. We've been painfully reminded of that during the pandemic, where we've seen science misused or ignored. But if anything, we need to lift up, we need to use the tools of science to lift up equity. And I'll just sketch out one example and come back to more examples later. For example, we have, over the course of that history, MPCC scientists and scientists at our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene have developed the Heat Vulnerability Index, which couples physical climate information with socioeconomic factors, and really was a backbone element of developing the Cool Neighborhoods heat management strategy that helps identify the people who deserve and need the help most, so that we can actually direct and prioritize our resiliency efforts. And we saw that play out this summer, where when elderly people in minority communities were stuck at home inside because of physical distancing measures, they were more vulnerable to heat. We were able to actually use the Heat Vulnerability Index and the template in Cool Neighborhoods and the progress we had made through that initiative to then come up with a program to get 74,000 air conditioners in elderly and minority homes to the people who need it most. So there is a transformation. We have not realized that entirely yet, but I think it's an exciting time because we're right in the middle of a transformation point. So I'll stop there and look forward to for discussing this more in the panel. And I want to turn it over to my colleague, Grant Irvin from Pittsburgh.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. It's really great to kind of sit in between Philadelphia and New York and Boston and share kind of our Pittsburgh experience. So it's a great honor to be here with everyone. I'm going to focus my remarks a little bit on specific our kind of resilience journey as it pertains to kind of our engagement with the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. I think because just understanding kind of the direction that Philadelphia is looking to take, we might be able to glean a couple of concepts that have been really helpful for us, I think, as we've developed a resilience program. As you know, the other cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, we've also been very engaged in climate planning work, really going back to about 2007, 2008, in the development of the first Pittsburgh climate action plans. But it was when Mayor Peduto, my boss, took office in 2013 and 2014 that we started to look a little bit beyond the roles of typical sustainability, if you will, and start to understand the need for integration of risk profiling and risk management as a way to kind of understand mostly our engagement with community organizations and activities and climate risk and how that plays a role in community and economic development. And we came upon the 100 Resilient Cities program as an opportunity for us to effectively develop that integration between the concepts of resilience and the concepts of sustainability. And there's four kind of, I would say, key principles that were a part of the 100RC process that are really formative. First, the establishment of the role of the Chief Resiliency Officer, and a person within city government that has the ability to connect within different departments and form both cross-departmental collaboration, but also cross-sector collaboration, which I think is really important as building resilience, both in terms of city operations, but also building resilience across the community. So that individual that can be the connector and the integrator of policies and programs. The second is the development of a preliminary resilience assessment, which I'll dive into a little bit deeper in a moment. But really the first kind of fundamental understandings, or a deep dive, if you will, in terms of understanding what the shocks and stressors of a city are. The third pillar of the program is the development of a strategy and having a key strategy partner in that process. For us at the city of Pittsburgh, it was the RAND Corporation, who has offices based in Pittsburgh, but also kind of at a plethora of university resources that we have available through us in our community, both through the development of our ultimate kind of concept or application, but also through the research and development and testing and piloting of a lot of different ideas and activities that we identified through the resilience strategy process. And the fourth portion is the idea of what we call the platform partnership. And this is basically the idea of having a collection of resource providers, both NGOs, universities, for-profit organizations that are at the call of the community, at the call of the municipal government, to basically provide support services in developing different tactics and strategies to ultimately address different resilience issues. If I was to say there's one kind of criticism from that, and I think it's just kind of key to this conversation here today, one of the things that was missing from the 100RC program was really what I would call the third leg of the stool, where you had effectively the private sector through NGOs and private companies and cities at the table. But this third really critical piece is the aspect of having universities a part of the building of the resilience strategy, both from the idea of curriculum and pedagogy, but also in terms of the research and development capabilities, and maybe most formatively in the form of physical impact that a university has in a community. You'll hear later on in the conversation from my partner, Aurora Sherrard, about the role of the Higher Education Climate Consortium, which was one of our key components of our resilience strategy process and climate journey in Pittsburgh. And it's having that kind of key partner at your side through this type of journey that really, I think, elicits a lot of the creative thinking that we were able to develop, as well as carry out many of the aspects of the strategy that we were able to develop. If I could just kind of pivot a little bit, in the beginning of that journey, and one of the first phases of the Rockefeller process was the creation of the preliminary resilience assessment. And I think this is a really critical juncture for a city who is embarking on resilience planning or climate planning too, but understanding the different aspects of stressors or the slow moving challenges that we endure day to day, as well as those shocks, those immediate negative impacts like a hurricane or an earthquake might levy on a community. And how those different aspects interplay with one another are very critical. And the way that process gets developed is kind of a twofold process. One, the engagement with the community. One of the key partnerships that we had in our process was working with Carnegie Mellon University on what's called a process of deliberative democracy, or deliberative forums, where neighbors would come together in small groups and have conversations around the critical issues of the day, and then couple that information with the data that we were able to gather. And ultimately what that did for us is provide a risk profile, or where challenges like the major stressors that we face, such as climate or ongoing systemic gender and racial inequality or aging infrastructure, as well as kind of those shock events, issues like a pandemic or a severe weather event. And putting that all together allows you to help build a very cogent strategy. Our strategy, known as 1PGH, which is basically pilfered from 1NYC. We weren't very creative in our naming rights there. And hat tip to Dan Zarilli and the team there in New York City for that. But the idea of building together a risk profile and then taking the strategy from that aspect takes on a different lens. Typically, community strategies are organized in a fashion of, what is the blue sky thinking and the opportunity in the future versus what are the things that I'm worried about at night, what's keeping me up. And so that turn of kind of process really allows you to start to create what we call in the resilience space, either multi-attributional benefit, or the simpler said, the resilience dividend, coined by Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation. This idea that you can create more benefits than just one outcome through an activity. And that is really a critical component of that strategy building process. As a result of that, in the completion of the strategy, we have done a great deal, I think, of shifting and aligning our thinking within city government post-strategy. So some of the major things that came out of our 1PGH process, which we completed in 2017 and 2018, have included deep dives in the creation of the city's first equity indicators, or 85 measures of inequality across the city of Pittsburgh. And we have taken that information as we have formed a Gender Equity Commission, as we've opened our first Office of Equity, and then started now to develop our first climate adaptation planning for city operations. And that's that lens that really started to formulate through the community engagement process, through the resilience strategy, and now is starting to formulate itself into further decision support tools, as well as policy and investment decisions. One of the other things I just want to kind of leave with is the really important role that universities can have in terms of creating this cross-sector collaboration. So we, in cities and municipal government, you hear a lot about town-gown issues, and really we have to not just cohabitate, but in order for a city to thrive, their institutions, particularly in college towns like ours, really need to find ways in which to foster meaningful collaboration. And that's been one of the hallmarks of our work in Pittsburgh, is having the ability to engage with university practitioners, not just because they're at a university, but in many cases because they're our neighbors. So these ideas of providing the solutions for the city writ large are really a mutual benefit that we all share. And some of the ways that we've been able to activate that have been through programs like our Metro 21 or Metro Lab programs at Carnegie Mellon, where we intersect research and development with university practitioners and student-led classes on different resilience activities, as well as physical manifestations like our process that we've developed through our Department of City Planning, known as the Institutional Master Planning process. And the University of Pittsburgh has been really at the leading edge of that in terms of taking their physical built plant and starting to integrate these different aspects of sustainability and resilience into their, not just their program delivery, but the physical embodiment of the university, which overall strengthens the city as a whole. So with that, I'll just kind of stop there and look forward to the conversation. And we'll pivot to Carl, my friend from Boston.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grant. It's great to be on a panel with Grant and Adam. And welcome, congratulations to Salim, and welcome to the family of cities. One of the things that Grant has touched on in his reference discussion of 100 resilient cities is that one of the major, probably the major place where I go, and that the city of Boston goes when it needs advice on what to do, is to talk with our colleagues and our counterparts in other cities, both around the country and around the world. It's been an important part of the development of our work in Boston through groups like the 100 Resilient Cities, through the C40 network, the global network of cities, through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, where we've been meeting for years. And it's an amazing resource of people and knowledge and experience, because one of the key things that I've found in adaptation and thinking about climate resilience is that it really depends on local solutions. It doesn't lend itself very much to top-down thinking, even though that's always a component. But to talk with the practitioners is essential and provides an essential foundation for the work that we all do. And it's been a great personal pleasure to work with my colleagues in other cities here in the US. Boston got its start in climate adaptation in 2007 when the city issued its first and very thin climate plan. And as part of that, the then Mayor Thomas Menino issued an executive order that included a direction that all municipal offices should start including the projected effects of climate change in their projects, planning, and permitting. Frankly, that direction at the time was more aspirational than concrete because we really didn't have much of a basis for moving forward besides the general idea. But in 2007, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which has its offices across the river from Boston and Cambridge, issued its first report on the projected effects of climate change in the Northeast. And they made a presentation in the mayor's conference room that had a powerful effect on the way we were thinking about it. The major impetus at that point was to lower carbon emissions. And the need for adaptation was acknowledged, but it tended to be downplayed because at that time, and maybe others could comment on this too, it was often considered that the talk too much about mitigation was defeatist or too pessimistic, that we really needed to focus on reducing carbon emissions. And even though the need for adaptation was not denied, it struggled for sort of legitimation in the early years. And I know in Boston, the effect of that had was that we relied a lot on informal networks, on working quietly, on reaching for allies and opportunities as they arose, rather than developing a comprehensive structural problem and institutional approach to the issues that we had to address then. Because of the role of the Union of Concerned Scientists and their presence in the Boston area, that gave us an early entree into the circle of scientists in the Boston area who were thinking about climate change at that time. And Paul Kirshen, who's going to speak later, was a member of that group. And the city and the universities in Boston, as a result of that, and as a result of their presence in Boston generally and their involvement in many issues, started developing a lot of very close informal ties. I had many members of the universities were serving as mostly informal advisors to the work that we were doing in the city, and also getting the students involved and having them do work for us too. The turning point, a major turning point, as Adam already talked about, was Hurricane Sandy. The city of Boston had, again, already had done its first climate action plan. It had done its first major update of the climate action plan, which included a major section on adaptation, but it still had trouble getting real resources associated with that. As a result of Hurricane Sandy and the work in New York and in the areas around New York around a project called Rebuild by Design, people started to think about what that would mean in Boston. We looked very closely at the structure of Rebuild by Design. It didn't look quite the right thing for us. As among other things, we didn't have the promise of a huge influx of federal aid to support the work, in part because we did not suffer major damage from Hurricane Sandy. But as a result of that, we started a process called Climate Ready Boston. Climate Ready Boston was a collaboration between the city and an organization called the Green Building Commission in Boston. I'm sorry, the Green Ribbon Commission in Boston. The Green Ribbon Commission had come together in 2010 when we were doing our first update completing our first update of our climate action plan. And it was a group of about 30 leaders of the major institutions, businesses, and government institutions in Boston. And they came together to support the city's implementation of its updated climate action plan. A very important piece of the Green Ribbon Commission was that it was actually not a creature of the city. It was not appointed by the mayor. It was not supported by the mayor in any, or by the city in any, financial or legal way. It was, again, an informal network of major business and institutional leaders in Boston who wanted to help us get things done. The mayor is a member of the Green Ribbon Commission. We coordinate very closely with the Green Ribbon Commission, but what it represented was the voluntary efforts and support of major institutional and business players in Boston, stressing the importance of thinking about climate, and because of the explicit charge when it came together of implementing the plans that we were creating, it gave a major impetus to our work. So the Climate Ready Boston project was supported by the Green Ribbon Commission and the city, and by the state also. We had support from the state as part of this. We produced a first comprehensive projection of very localized climate projections for Boston, the most thorough analysis of the vulnerability of Boston to climate change, and most important, a comprehensive set of strategies and measures to implement in putting that together. The University of Massachusetts of Boston led the work to update the city's climate projections with the in participation of many of our local other local academic institutions. And that has set a pattern for the work that we have been doing since then. It is a constant interplay between formal and informal networks, between the universities, the city, the state, and other local players. It includes a great involvement of the community. We have, even then, we had extensive community engagement opportunities to make sure that everyone's voice was heard to address the many equity issues that both Grant and Adam referred to. And it's continued since then. We are now embarking on much more detailed and specialized evaluations of specific neighborhoods and specific climate-related problems, whether it's coastal flooding or heat, in the way that both Adam and Grant have talked about. And we continue in that very collaborative and distributed and often decentralized way of working. A very important part of this is that we have succeeded in embedding and integrating the work of our climate planning, both on carbon reduction and in climate adaptation, into all major city plans. So a few years ago, the Mayor Walsh directed that the city produce its first citywide master plan in 50 years. And one of the pillars of that plan was climate action. Similarly, it was followed by a major transportation plan. And again, both climate adaptation and carbon reduction were one of the central pillars of those plans. So we're seeing a continued integration of the work of climate planning across city government, just as we're seeing an integration of our climate work across the Boston community, in the institutions, the businesses, and in the neighborhoods. Why don't I stop there, because I think it just becomes an elaboration on points that Grant and Adam have already made, and I'll turn it back to Salim. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Adam, Grant, and Carl. There's so much to sort of unpack there, and I really can't wait to get into this panel. I did want to start off by just asking a few follow-up questions, and so maybe we can start with New York. I know New York sort of recently launched the New York panel on climate change 4.0. I wanted to know sort of what key changes to the structure and objectives to the panel were, and specifically sort of building on your point about sort of the need to take transformation seriously and integrate equity into the process.
Yeah, thanks, Salim. We did just launch the fourth cycle of NPCC. One of the changes that we made was that we did an open nominations process. And that was to try to be more inclusive and more sort of welcoming of not just new expertise, but diverse expertise and diverse people. I am thrilled to say that for the 15 spots that were open outside of our 5 co-chairs, there were 80 nominations. We have more expertise on environmental justice and equity than ever before. We have more women from the sciences and from research than ever before, including women of color. So really thrilled about the way that that's turned out. We have exceptional diversity of expertise, including folks from practical disciplines, I would say, or more practically oriented disciplines like engineering, architecture, and urban planning. And that's very indicative of our sort of phase of work, which is that we are embarking on implementing resiliency projects and adaptation projects. And these are multi-million, multi-billion-dollar projects like coastal protection projects and hardening of critical infrastructure. And we're just finding that our science needs still require the sort of thought in how to do planning, but we also really are looking at feasibility and things like how not just the physical science or the sort of physical climate conditions change over the life of, say, a large capital project, but how do socioeconomic factors change, and how do you incorporate that into the way government does business? So that's really going to be exciting. And then we're building on with the expanded environmental justice expertise. I should have mentioned that a real hallmark of the last and third New York City panel on climate change process was some work with community-based organizations in communities that traditionally have been excluded from resources on community-based adaptation, looking at not just government adaptation planning processes, but non-governmental adaptation planning processes, and how you use qualitative and quantitative data. So we're really excited to have this expanded expertise on environmental justice and equity, work with the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and think about how do we take our goal of being more equitable to another level. And so that's some of the things that we're excited about most recently. One other just quick thing I'll say, tracing back to that history, is we just released, and City Council just adopted the 4th version of our climate resiliency design guidelines, which is fantastic. That has been NPCC climate projections, and multiple successive generations of NPCC projections over the first 3 assessment reports have been the foundational information for that in the wake of Sandy, and even now for hundreds of retrofits and new builds. We point people to future climate risk information and ask them to do risk assessments and to think about how to factor that future information into their design and building.
Great, that's really amazing, and congratulations on getting that passed. I want to bring in my co-moderator, Julia Rockwell, to maybe sort of pose the next question. Julia, you have any follow-ups?
Thanks, Salim. And first off, thank you to all the panelists for your very thoughtful and informative remarks. It's really exciting to be able to engage with you all today. So I think I'm going to move on to kind of a broader question about what you are most proud to have achieved to date, especially as we realize the need to shift away from incrementalism towards more transformative changes that really address the scale of climate change. What have you found thus far to have provided the greatest value towards a more resilient city, and why? Maybe we can kick off with Pittsburgh providing an answer to that question. Grant?
That's not a softball, Julia.
Yeah, sorry. I'm diving right in.
You know, a couple of things I would point to without deeper introspection is, you know, two things. One is I think the community engagement that we did in developing our resilience strategy, both the strategy as well as our application to the Rockefeller program, were a community building effort. So we had, you know, wasn't like the typical grant application where you're hard pressed in a room and putting together content, but we really brought together a lot of partners to ask the questions, what should we focus on? And then once we were a part of the program, you know, that community engagement continued and continues to this day, frankly, where a lot of the folks that we had convened are really close partners of not just city government, but of our team and people that we can lean to and are really kind of mentors and advisors for us. And I think, you know, everybody here working in city or municipal government knows the challenge that is. It's not your normal day job in many respects. And so the aspect that they are, you know, still there with us, I think is a testament to kind of the work that we've collectively done. And also continually trying to find ways in which we can improve. The second piece I would say that also most proud of, I mentioned the importance of the preliminary resilience assessment. And while this isn't necessarily a badge of honor, but everything that, you know, our partners in the community effectively predicted as part of being risks and threats are things that we've faced over the last 4.5 years. You know, so whether if it is a major climate event like extreme heat or the polar vortex or flooding and landslides, infrastructure failure, and now a global pandemic, these were all kind of risks that we identified. And as part of that, one of the things that we have done well, I think, as an administration is taking these lessons and applying them to policy and programs. You know, so you can see the development of our Office of Equity and our Gender Equity Commission and an LGBTQIA Commission. And, you know, so those types of engagements and giving people voices really result from an understanding and listening. Likewise, we've seen the same things materialize, whether it's investments in affordable housing or addressing infrastructure needs in the energy and water sector. These were, you know, risks and threats that we identified in 2015-16 and have subsequently worked to address them. Rebuilding an entire water system to remove lead, installing our first green infrastructure program in our water and sewer authority, getting a new water and sewer authority. You know, like, so these are things that are fundamental. You don't necessarily see them on the scoreboard, but it really is about how we transform kind of the role and the space that we're in local government.
Great, thank you, Grant. Maybe we can move on to Boston briefly. And I wanna mention we do have our 3 other panelists from academic institutions. Please chime in to any of these responses. You know, as you may come up with answers. We have Dr. Sherrard, Dr. Selecki, and Dr. Kirschen. So Boston, maybe let's move on to you in terms of what you think has been one of your biggest successes in terms of really moving towards transformational change when it comes to climate resilience.
Sure. Well, not to depress anyone, but I think, you know, one thing that we need to face is that we're going to be working on climate adaptation or climate resilience for a long time, you know, 50 years, 100 years, because the climate's going to keep changing. And that is almost irrespective of how well we do in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So one thing that has been very important for us is that we have succeeded in getting climate adaptation, resilience, very well embedded in the culture of not just city government, but in the community too, that people are thinking about it, that even in the current pandemic crisis, where frankly, the people who are in general most affected by COVID-19 are the same people who are most likely to be vulnerable to the changes in the climate. But even in the midst of this this pandemic, there's still attention being paid to climate, of the need to address both the causes of climate change and the effects of climate change in our climate resilience and climate adaptation programs. It's been embedded, as I mentioned before, it's embedded in, it's a central pillar of the citywide plan that the city has. We've got it included in budget processes and other evaluation processes, and that is reflected in the way that many people are in the community as a whole are talking about it. And to go back to the role of universities, how it's become a major part of many curriculums in universities and of multiple different programs. So I think that's a major accomplishment, and you see that reflected in the work that's happening in Pittsburgh, and in New York City too, both at an institutional and a cultural level.
Great, thank you. New York, do you have anything to add? So we've heard about the importance of integration into city planning processes, the importance of community engagement, engaging with institutions in our cities and our region. Anything else you want to add to kind of these big drivers for transformational change?
No, I think just we look back on just to build on Carl's point, I think one of the other things that we're most proud of, or that I'm most proud of, and I've really been thinking about this a lot lately as we've launched the next MPCC, is the local law. That we've institutionalized this because, as Carl said, it's going to take generations to really make ourselves more resilient and to adapt to climate change. That's going to be, a continual process. So having that law in place really helps weather changes in administrations at multiple levels of government, and kind of creates a foundation upon which we can build a sustained assessment process. We have sustained MPCC, but I think we're looking at new elements of how to make the assessment process more accessible through community engagement, through some of the kinds of things that Grant and Carl both touched on. But I don't know if Bill has anything else to offer there.
Well, I'll pick up since you threw the ball my way. It's an interesting question in terms of things most proud of, or sort of singularly important and preparing for transformation. I think picking up on Carl's point, and to some extent things we heard from Adam and also from Grant. I think a critical, and I've been just to sort of qualify, my colleague Cynthia Rosenzweig and I did our first sort of New York kind of climate change study in 1998. So it's been a long time. And, to Carl's point, it was tough to get people interested in these kinds of questions. But one of the things we kind of identified early on is that while we do this work, we need to sort of engage, with the stakeholders that might be interested in that. And that really kind of reflects kind of a change going on within academics for several decades, but really to sort of do more applied, engaged, and even activist research. So I think, taking those concepts and putting them into place was certainly a success. So but I think the other thing, it's really quite fundamental and maybe somewhat simple, but is this the notion of non-stationarity, that, we're dealing in a dynamic situation, because in talking with stakeholders and folks, back in the early aughts, it was sort of, well, we've got a really robust, risk protection system for the city. We have drains that are so big. We have, windows that withstand a certain amount of wind speed and all the other kind of sort of metrics. And to sort of get into the space of the discussion that, yes, that's correct, but the future is going to be different. And then to sort of illustrate that through consecutive and sequential sort of modeling in routines, not necessarily my domain, but in others within the group, to look at sea level rise and to sort of look at the trends of sea level rise and match it to the model projections. It was really kind of that in itself was a transformative moment that I think, both the scientific community and the practitioner community kind of enjoyed at the same time, sort of looking at the data and understanding that, at a real simple level, all of the very complex rules and regs and standards that have been developed to protect buildings and cities and roads and highways and people from risks and hazards might not be appropriate in a future. And that we need to not only think about non-stationary of climate, but also policy has to adjust and adapt as well. So I know that's sort of like, maybe too old school for this conversation, but like that fundamental kind of change in consciousness has really spawned like a whole new appreciation and a whole new level of engagement.
No, those are some really key points. And I feel like this is a perfect time to kind of pivot to the conversation about collaboration and sort of bring in our academic partners to really talk about this. So, Philadelphia, similar to some of the other cities represented here, sort of have a wealth of academic institutions to draw off of. Drexel's hosting this session today. So I would love to sort of hear what aspects of collaboration that you all have found have worked well, anything successes that have sort of emerged to date, and really specifically, how do you align research with the need of city offices? And so maybe we'll start with Pittsburgh, because I know Pittsburgh talked a little bit about, in Grant's remarks, some of the academic partnerships. So maybe we can start with Aurora to talk a little bit about sort of what those relationships look like.
Sure, I'll start off, and then I know Grant's going to want to add in as well. So in Pittsburgh, we have a higher education climate consortium that's been in existence since 2007. It's somewhere between 8 and 12 colleges and universities collaborating on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the Pittsburgh region. Each of those institutions have different internal goals, different internal and external experts, different partnerships with the city itself. But HEC, as it likes to be called, as a collaboration, has been around for quite some time now. And everybody's at a different part in and place in their journey. I would say all of the universities are working to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. They partner with the city on curriculum, student projects, and things of that like. And then there are specific research projects that are either partnered directly with the city of Pittsburgh or help the city of Pittsburgh make decisions and make considerations in the realm of climate change and equity in ways that maybe it didn't think that it could or should. And so a lot of this conversation so far has been on mitigation and adaptation with a little bit of equity thrown in from the questions. And I'm going to try to pull that together with an example of a recent study that came out of the Pitt Graduate School of Public Health, which actually looked at the impact of air quality, which the Pittsburgh region has poor outdoor air quality, and its impact on environmental justice neighborhoods and how they're responding to COVID. And the study essentially showed, based on what these researchers were already showing, that environmental justice neighborhoods in Pittsburgh are 40% more likely to have adverse health impacts related to COVID and because of their poor air quality. That's also a direct correlation to all of our climate change impacts. Carnegie Mellon, as a converse, has a lot of very strong relationships with the city and actually did, as part of a student project, the first greenhouse gas inventory for the city of Pittsburgh and is working a lot on city buildings. So with that, I'll turn it over to Grant to clean up what I missed.
No, I think it's great. I mean, it really runs the gamut. And, one of the things that um, I could say about each of our universities is that, they're all the same, but they're all different. And they've provided different partnerships in different ways. Pitt, for example, is we kind of lean on them as like, our systems thinkers and implementers in terms of policy, and have done a lot of work with the School of Engineering around energy systems and microgrids and district heating, as well as with the Mascaro School thinking about circular economy applications and workforce development training programs. Whereas Carnegie Mellon, for example, has been much more in tune with us in terms of kind of student and R&D projects, and some of the applied sciences. So each one has been really formative in those specific aspects. But one of the things I think is really key and unique to think about as we plan for resilience is to be able to leverage those specialized capacities within universities that they might specialize in, but also understand the role of their physical plant. So whether it's managing stormwater or energy production or energy efficiency activities, they have huge impacts in terms of the physical built and natural environment. And so understanding what the role is of those campuses is really critical as we think about developing and implementing some of our climate action strategies, because we can't do it alone effectively. So, a move made by Aurora and the University of Pittsburgh is a fundamental shift in terms of our energy mix and, our different grid factor compositions, or, Carnegie Mellon's decision to manage stormwater on their campus impacts the neighborhood that surrounds them. So taking these things into consideration and leveraging kind of the physical plant, I think, is a really key aspect of the university-city relationship.
Please, Paul, do you have something to add? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so, back up a little bit about, why universities at all. So universities are places that, where knowledge is created, new knowledge is applied, knowledge is reviewed. And the climate change field is so rapidly changing every day that if you're really going to, understand climate change, you've really got to bring in this new knowledge. And so there is a real major role of universities in supporting cities in climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I think that's, so I think if you look at a start from that climate change is so rapidly changing, you need to bring in the people that are creating and using this new knowledge if you're going to really be successful in climate change management. Now, in Boston, as Carl pointed out, from my perspective of being someone at the university, most of the collaboration has been informal. We don't have a sitting Boston, climate change panel. Yet universities have worked together on particular projects. I think the first time we actually worked together, at least from my perspective, was in 2014, where UMass Boston led a team of universities in Boston and throughout the state to put together the first set of comprehensive climate change projections for the city of Boston. There have been many projections of climate changes in Boston. So as the city was about to start their first vulnerability assessment, they needed one set to work from. So, a group was created, the BRAG, Boston Research Advisory Group, to review all the science on climate change projections and develop projections that we thought were so-called the best for sea level rise, precipitation and temperature and storms. And that involved, again, about a half dozen university partners in Metro Boston. And that came out in 2014. And now we have the GBRAG, where we're just updating that. And essentially the same group of players, just updating those climate change projections with the newest science. the fact that that there's sort of this informal collaboration has led to perhaps like, BU has taken the lead, Boston University seems to have taken the lead on greenhouse gas mitigation. UMass Boston were heavily involved in adaptation. So another large project we led was looking at the feasibility of building a harbor, of using a large harbor-wide barrier to protect the city of Boston from present and future flooding. And again, that was an effort led by UMass Boston, but we had some other university partners in that as well as consultants. And I think, the outcome of that was essentially that, at least perhaps till the end of the century, it does not make sense to build a large harbor-wide barrier to protect Boston from coastal flooding. And it's a lot better to concentrate on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And then soon after our report came out, the mayor came out with a policy statement that, yeah, the city is going to use shore-based solutions in green infrastructure. I think even though there's not a formal structure for universities to advise the city and the region, we do have an impact. And I also want to make one more comment about the nature of funding. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, up until around 2015 or 16, the city had not really put a large amount of financial resources into adaptation. Most of the funding was coming from foundations with a small amount from the city. But it seems to me recently, the city has made major investments in adaptation planning. And they've grown their staff, and they've become a lot more proactive in this. And I think those of us in the university community think it's great, and we continue to work with the city on various aspects of adaptation.
Yeah, if I may, so Paul makes great points, and yes, it's been the dedicated resources on adaptation have been a while in coming, but there's an interesting point about the relationship between the city and the universities, and I wonder, Paul and the other Bill and the other folks from universities, how they would react to it. The report that Paul mentioned on the feasibility of a harbor-wide barrier, in some quarters, got a lot of criticism. And Paul, maybe you heard this too, but I was told in a public forum that the university led the project to evaluate the feasibility of the harbor-wide barrier. Well, they only reached the conclusion that the city had already decided it wanted to see. In other words, Paul shake his head, and I absolutely know that's not the case, and I was quite vehement in denying that was the case, because actually I actually thought the conclusion would be go the other way. But I wonder from the folks in the universities whether they worry about the perception of their independence if they get too involved or get too tied in with, some processes that are inherently political.
So let me just jump in. At least I don't worry about that because the university team is going to do unbiased research that follows the data and follows the results. And as long as we keep that in mind, I think we're okay. And as long as we can justify everything we do and don't become advocates for our outcomes. And the Harbor Barrier Report, I'll tell you, after the first couple of months, when we found out that the barrier might not have major impacts on the water quality and may not have major impacts, in fact, we have no impacts on the tidal regime of Boston Harbor, we thought that, man, this barrier might really be feasible. And it wasn't, until we did more analysis and found more technical and economic and environmental problems that it started to become very much apparent to us that, a barrier was not the way to go. And also, I think universities can cover themselves by having large steering committees that represent all the interests and make sure our work is very transparent so everybody can see what we're doing. And of course, we always want to publish our results, which also adds another level of justification for our work, because people know it's going to be peer reviewed. So I don't worry about this, Carl. Maybe I should, but I don't, because I think we have enough built-in systems to protect ourselves. But I remember that flack. I remember the flack we got for a lot of other stuff we've done. But anyway, thank you.
Maybe I could jump in a little bit. I mean, maybe I'm not as sanguine, I guess. I mean, sort of, I think there are issues. It's not so much, there is certainly in the, this sort of dialogue and relationship between the practitioner and the science community is sort of multifaceted. There's a sort of boundary space in between. I mean, one of the things that I learned early on, and I had probably the most intense arguments with my colleagues about, crossing that boundary into the policy realm and like sort of, almost going rogue into that space, and sort of like, you can't, there needs to be that sort of, not only from our perspective on the science side, do we need to be able to maintain our objectivity and always sort of reflect on it, but also not be sort of drawn in, as like moths to a flame a little bit. I think the challenges that come up though are another aspect of the challenge is once the knowledge is created, how is it used or misused? And what happens when you see that it's misused? And then how does that sort of start to impinge upon, professional relationships, that might be emerging in this sort of context between scientists and practitioners. And I think that's sort of the space. I could think of many examples where we've produced results under a range of different, not so much only in New York City, but in other settings, where then the results are really not, brought forward. And then so we as scientists are sort of wondering, like, how do we then proceed? Do we go sort of around the process? And we've had that, to speak bluntly, we've had that instance where people will, individuals within the science community will try to move around what they see as an obstacle to sort of knowledge and information being widespread. And that has then sort of huge blowbacks into the relationship. So it's, it's a very complicated sort of nest of things. As we launched this past NPCC, I brought some of that forward. And I think that is something that the science community always has to reflect on, sort of maintaining their ethics, objectivity. I think individually we do that, but sort of the problem becomes when we act collectively, and how to sort of manage that.
An entirely different answer for you. As someone with an academic background, but in a position that is not academic. So I personally report up into business and operations at the University of Pittsburgh and collaborate across the university with the academic side and with the operational side. And as Grant knows, I used to work for a local nonprofit organization, Green Building Alliance, in Pittsburgh for over a decade. So I was the advocate, right? But I think one of the things that we do as sustainability practitioners, and especially sustainability practitioners who use a data-informed decision-making approach, is you can't just look at the science, because we are not scientists, we are society. So we have to consider policy, we have to consider people, we have to consider how science and people work together as a system and give people the best information that they can to make the decisions to move forward. And that's the interesting part of working with a government, right? Because they don't necessarily have a pre-dedicated answer either. They certainly know what would be easiest, right? Most cost-effective, most well-received by the community. But I think we're all wrestling with all of those pieces together. And most honestly, back to the funding question, when the city isn't paying you to do the research, you're really looking as an academic and as a researcher for the best answer that does that balance that we all crave of equity, environment, and economics. And I think that, I hate to say well-meaning, but like that ethos, those values are the most important part of the technical outcomes, right?
I'd love to actually chime in just on a couple bits on New York City and what we've learned from this, if I may, and pick up on a couple of things that Bill said. I do think that, you don't learn anything unless you make some mistakes. And I think what we've learned over time is that the process of co-production of knowledge is, while it holds great promise and it's great to see more of the scientific community embracing that as a concept, we still need to sort of sharpen our attention to process. We've asked a lot of MPCC members. There's been process fatigue. There's definitely been some blurring of professional, or you heard Bill's reflection. But what are we doing about it? Because we still do want to produce knowledge collaboratively. We do still feel like that's the best way to make the outputs of MPCC most useful. So what we're doing about it is, first, my position was actually created out of the acknowledgement that that the city's primary liaison to MPCC has always been the fraction of someone's time. And so there was a need to actually start to embed more capacity within the mayor's office and city government to work with MPCC. The second thing, and this is very much still like very, very early days for MPCC4, but I've been having very, in-depth and in some cases, critical conversations, but with the co-chairs for MPCC4. But I think we have a lot of work to do with the panel to do this, but we are looking towards coming up with some guidelines and some explicit statements about what scientific integrity means, so we can maintain that through the process, even as we co-produce knowledge. Those things need to be written down and returned to throughout the process. The other thing I want to touch on here, and that's even more important when we think about engaging communities, because we do not want the knowledge production process, even under the auspice of co-production, engagement can be extractive, and we don't want that. We actually want to be setting expectations really clear and make sure that folks feel like they get something out of the co-production process. That can be anywhere from sort of more information for them to talk to the people that in their neighborhood or their neck of the woods, in a distilled, translated way, that can be lending expertise, and that can be having people to help manage the process, in between government and society. So I think we're excited about thinking about scientific integrity and engagement and how it happens in MPCC4. The last thing I want to say is that on this issue of some of how we've used, for example, sea level rise projections with the city, we're facing a daunting amount of sea level rise. I'm very excited in this new position to be able to start to develop, and this will be a process, resources so that with MPCC and with a wider network of researchers, we can examine socioeconomic dimensions of coastal adaptation. Right now, because we've had a lot of physical science and we've had successive improvements in our sea level rise projections, a lot of MPCC reports have the maps, and the maps have been hugely helpful for us to that was informative. And when we contested FEMA, those maps and the elevations embedded in them, the flood elevations embedded in them, are set design elevations for some of our coastal protection projects. But those coastal protection projects are not just about the physical risks. It's about the communities behind those protection projects. And we don't have as much information about the change, the socioeconomic change, and hopefully the equity transformations that are going to occur behind those coastal protection projects. So right now, I don't actually think that we're completely framing risks and vulnerabilities Again, that's one of the reasons why we're excited to have diverse expertise on MPCC. I recall, just ending with a personal anecdote, I was the lead author on the sea level rise scenarios for the third US National Climate Assessment, the input report. And when we came out and said that the highest scenario was 6 feet, I also got a lot of flack for that, and remember some pretty intense conversations. Now, you could be criticized if you don't acknowledge 6 feet. So my point is that, as the science evolves, so does the perception of risk, and so does the other dimensions, transdisciplinary dimensions of what we're communicating to people with respect to climate hazards and opportunities for resiliency and adaptation.
I have a quick follow-on to Adam's point, if I could. Salim, I'm not sure.
Yeah, let's make it quick, and I'm gonna do my best presidential debate moderator and move us on.
Hopefully better than
That'd
that.
be good. All right. So, Adam raised a really interesting point about the numbers. And I think one of the really key kind of interplays between the science and the practitioner community is how to define, there's definitely co-generation of knowledge, but then the critical thing is that how is that knowledge then translated? Like which knowledge then becomes like the cornerstone or the benchmark that's put forward. So of course, like in New York City, there was a tremendous amount of discussion about like what range of projections to publish. And I know each of the cities, I always look to you, Carl, and other folks and Paul in Boston about, that you guys published the 99.99, those really high-end scenarios. And so, and New York did the 90th percentile. What I'm saying is like, it's both as the knowledge is produced and co-produced, how does it then get translated, into like the public forums for debate and discussion? Huge part of the process.
Julia, do you want to take
Yeah, I thought maybe we could, thank you all for that discussion. I thought maybe we could pivot a bit to intergovernmental collaboration. So we've talked a bit about city and institutional collaboration, but we know that interagency coordination and communications are so critical for resilience work. Yet I think we can say that most city governments are not set up at a governance level to facilitate this degree of partnership while still ensuring key project ownership and action. So I just would like to get some feedback on how your cities have been addressing this challenge, what you feel has been working, what you think you could do differently. And I thought we could kind of start things off by actually taking a couple questions from our audience members who have had a few questions kind of in this vein. So maybe starting with, this could really go to anyone. Maybe we'll start with Pittsburgh or anyone who has a response to this question first. So have you integrated climate resilience into your hazard mitigation planning work? And if you have, has it helped leverage potential funding? So that's like one specific question maybe we can get at, but if, whoever starts off, if you could maybe speak, briefly to what you think has worked really well in terms of interagency coordination.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. And just to put a Pennsylvania lens real quickly and speak to Julie and Salim for a quick second directly. One of the opportunity areas I think Philadelphia has as a city and a county is really a critical kind of integration aspect because of the role of social service delivery at the county level in Pennsylvania. And that's a big kind of opportunity, I think, where we in Pittsburgh and 66 other counties have a different challenge because of the service delivery role of county government and municipal government. And that plays actually into kind of the question. One of the big challenges we have is that our hazard mitigation plans are set at the county level and in many cases delivered at a local level. And while we've done a lot of really good work, I think incorporating our partners in Homeland Security, for example, and we're in Region 13, which has been a really formative part of our risk threat assessment, which was really good. The challenge that we're at right now is in the implementation and delivery. So you have a lot of history as well as jurisdiction that you have to overcome, I think, as you start to implement this type of thinking. And, you know, the BRIC program is a really good example where we're having a tough time, frankly, in conversations related to, you know, buyouts and retaining walls versus thinking about the weaving together of climate strategy. We've had a similar type of challenge with wastewater treatment. And, you know, we have a wastewater treatment program that services 83 municipalities in Allegheny County here in southwestern Pennsylvania. And when I first came on board and I asked if our precipitation projections incorporated, you know, some of the latest climate assessments, and I literally got laughed at. And, you know, walked away from that meeting and said, oh boy, this is going to be an uphill battle. You know, so a lot of what we've tried to do in that regard is two things. One, educate. So bring those folks along for the ride, get into the table. And one of the things that's been most successful, you know, kind of leveraging our platform partnership through the Rockefeller program, to go back to that, was doing quick scenario planning. So not trying to develop kind of a long 150-page strategic document, but doing some quick scenario planning with you know, specific geographies or specific projects or incident response. And what that has done is really helped us build the relationship and human capital to connect on other strategic opportunities. Doesn't give us the fundamental change that we would want necessarily from the get-go, but it really starts to build the human relationships, which I think, you know, are part of the starting point that we're in many cases in.
Thank you, Grant.
Just a quick comment on that. So, you know, that our climate plan is integrated into our natural hazards mitigation plan. But it was, this was a matter of beyond communications. It's a difficult fit, and it also speaks to, as I'm sure we've all experienced, what happens when you get a culture clash. At least here in Boston, most of the people in our Office of Emergency Management, which has responsibility for our natural hazards mitigation plan, are coming out of, you know, a uniformed service, whether it's from the military or from fire and police. And it was a challenging clash of cultures in terms of how we think about things. I have now that's not to say I have enormous respect for my colleagues in that office, and over time relations have gotten much better. But when we initially started, it was a bit of butting heads about sort of expectations of not just whether it's appropriate to consider climate, but what a plan even looks like. So we have overcome that, but it was a journey.
Thank you, Carl. We have a note from an audience member too, that relationship building with state hazard mitigation officers is also hugely important. So, you know, these layers of coordination that are needed to integrate all this work is overwhelming, but also, as I think we all are learning, super critical. I think we're already at 5:30. So Salim, I think we wanted to transition to kind of another topic and set of questions. I'll let you kick that off.
Yeah, I mean, we probably were overambitious in the amount of topics we wanted to cover, but we could have had a 2-hour conversation about any of these. But I wanted to kind of move us to talk a little bit about climate justice specifically. Adam in his remarks sort of alluded to sort of how environmental justice is sort of being integrated into some of the processes that you all are thinking about doing. So I wanted to pick on an audience question, but expand it a little bit to how are your cities sort of trying to address the root cause of inequality, specifically the experience of Black, Indigenous, and other historically marginalized communities, whether it's through environmental justice policies or otherwise. And maybe we'll start with Adam, just because you mentioned it before.
Thanks, Liam. Well, like I said, we've now have the Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and they have a specific charge to create a map of environmental justice communities and release that publicly, and also do an analysis of environmental justice, of plans of environmental justice groups. So really sort of taking all the active groups around the city who've done a ton of work on climate and environmental justice, and bringing them together into something that really sort of charts the way to a citywide initiative. And so I am extremely excited to work with that group. I know that many on the New York City panel on climate change are. That work is the city counterpart to that board is our sister office, the Climate Policies and Programs. So I think that is really a central feature. But also, I think it's just about how we do civic engagement. There are, and this is one area that I think is really an opportunity for universities, or sort of two opportunities for universities. One is we don't, within the climate world, I think maybe sometimes we're a little less cognizant than we could be about the fact that there's a whole professional practice around civic engagement, around community development, people who work on participatory budgeting, people who work on, other community empowerment and development processes. I think sort of linking up not just the scholarship there, but the non-governmental partners like Public Agenda or Participatory Budgeting Project, who marshal those processes forward, and bringing them into the mix is really, really key. And then the second one for universities is our students, especially at public universities, because I think it's really important. Many of those students are not just in a community, they're of a community. Many, for example, the City University of New York, many students are from neighborhoods nearby. And that's actually really important because, it's good for those students then to be not just a part of the future workforce, which is important on resiliency and adaptation, but actually when an engagement process starts, that they are involved and that they are already, there is legitimacy for them to be initiating a dialogue with a neighborhood is really good. So that's just one specific example of how you, or sort of two examples on different scales of how you shore up civic engagement processes and do that engagement, whether it's for a plan or a project, or ideally for sort of the integration of them. So that's my take.
Those are some really interesting thoughts that you sort of talk about the role of universities. I wonder if any of our university partners had any thoughts in response to Adam's proposal.
I've got a really specific example for you, Adam, actually. So there's a Pitt student who I recently got to know this year. Her name is Oluchi Okafor. And she's actually, sometimes students, they really want to weigh in on climate change and divestment, and they don't necessarily understand all of the energy challenges and the decision-making challenges and the policy hurdles and opportunities. But Oluchi really dug in and said, you know what, I see people on the front lines having issues and I want to collect their stories. And so she started to do that. And she has her own Instagram page, and she's doing it related to both Braddock in Pennsylvania and also I think it's Bronx in New York. And then she's made that an academic project, and it's now her passion. And so I think we just need to find those ways to not just get universities involved, but also students on the front lines of helping us answer these hard questions.
I was just going to say, I think Adam sort of alluded to this. Sometimes universities, I think in Boston, it's been a situation where the foundation of the city will come to university and say, I want you to look at this. But sometimes, university, we're leading, we're conducting research like on environmental justice. And through some of the techniques that Adam talks about, we actually draw attention to the problem. And then at least we think somehow we then bring the city into it to look at it more more in depth. I don't know from Carl's perception if he thinks that or not, but I think in the academic community around Boston, we were, sort of thinking about climate justice a little bit in front of the city, and then the city, stepped in when they realized it was a major problem. So I think sometimes universities can lead, identify problems, which is also a good strength of having strong university relationships between the city and the university community. So I'd be curious what the city thinks about that and other cities think about that.
Well, let me say briefly. So I will dispute Paul only to the extent that I think we've actually had equity involved in the city's climate program and many other programs for years. But I think University of Massachusetts Boston, where Paul is just the kind of example that Adam was talking about, where it's not just the research and work that folks like Paul and his colleagues are doing, in terms of their research, but the involvement of the students, many local students, many non-traditional college students at the University of Boston, where I had the pleasure of spending a couple of years too, and as part of some of my graduate school work. It's a great example. I think an important point to keep in mind here is that, I think the environmental community and people who work on environmental issues, and that's whether they're in the neighborhoods or working for governments, I found among that community, there is a receptivity, a sensitivity to the issues around equity and racism, and that whole nexus of concerns. But there's also a limitation that we often come across, is that environmental justice is important, but it's a small piece of justice. And I know that, because I've experienced with, especially among the staff of the Environment Department, especially the newer and younger members of the staff, who are commendably and wonderfully energized to address these issues, but they get frustrated because, especially in government, that we have a certain set of responsibilities and a set of authorities and resources that we have to address and to use, and that in order to address the bigger problem, we need to take it elsewhere. And just as a simple example, we've been talking a lot about climate displacement, gentrification, climate gentrification, right? That as we implement adaptation measures, we may make certain communities more valuable, and therefore leading to just gentrification. Well, and I don't have any dispute with that, and I certainly share the concern about that, but then I have to go to my colleagues in the housing department in Boston, called the Department of Neighborhood Development, and get their involvement in it. And to them, the gentrification that's caused by climate adaptation measures is really a small piece of the much larger and enormous pressures leading to gentrification of the city, that it's hard to get their attention to it. So it's a really important issue, but there are, and certainly in Boston, we're taking not exactly the measures that Adam described, but an analogous set of measures to increase the role of equity in the work of our climate and environmental programs. But there are necessary limitations on what we can do through them.
If I could just add, Salim, one of the things that's been really fundamental for us has been, our partnership with our Office of Equity and having that dialogue and and kind of the ability to work hand in hand with them on a variety of different issues. And one of the things I mentioned a little bit in my opening remarks was the creation of our equity indicators program. And that was really came out of the identification of equity being a core issue in the resilience strategy as raised by the community. And then it became the so what, right? Like, what are we going to do about it? And so we really leaned in with our partners at the RAND Corporation and other kind of university researchers, most notably for the City University of New York and their equity indicator program, and then created a collaboration with 4 other cities that started to kind of work through these issues together. And what those indicators have done for us is start to pinpoint where the issues of inequality and inequity are most egregious. And so then that starts to leverage, or get the wheels turning in terms of like, what is then the policy and investment response? And 2 or maybe 3 examples that have kind of yielded from that, I think. One has been the development of community planning activities, most notably our Eco Innovation District program, which takes the Eco District principles and builds together through the community planning process these issues of environment and community and infrastructure into the community plan. So it really becomes kind of a bottom-up kind of conversation, born at the neighborhood level. The second has been, the issues of energy burden or fuel poverty. And we've seen this because of, the Venn diagram of our equity indicators and climate data in terms of seeing the poor performance of residential housing stock from an energy consumption and emission standards, but also the increased incidence of asthma in African-American boys. And so this is being disproportionately borne because of an aging housing stock that in a place like Pittsburgh and, all of our cities are pretty much in the same boat, where in some cases we've skipped a generation of updating the house. So there's no insulation, there's no updated windows. It's not so much the cost of utilities, but it's just a poor performing structure that's then creating stressors in the health and well-being of the people that are living there, which then metastasizes into a whole host of other challenges. And then finally, another kind of place that equity indicators have pointed us into is the issues of food insecurity. And just to pick up what Aurora was saying, we had a group this summer with the Watson Fellowship, where we worked with the Watson Fellows and a host of local farmers in the Pittsburgh area to gain their stories. And what that does is start to match, that real world anecdotal narrative with data. And that starts to make a really, I think, a stronger case in terms of whatever the intervention might be, because we're talking about real, impacting real people's lives and what policy is. It's not a faceless decision then.
Could I just add one other thing? I mean, I'm so encouraged by what Grant just said, and also what Carl said, and maybe this will dovetail a little bit, but just to sort of pivot to another dimension of this work. And first of all, I should have acknowledged the fact that, I am a white male, so I recognize my place of privilege and still learning how to better apply anti-racism. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And I say it's kick things off that way. And this sort of thread is that, there is also a huge dimension of our work that we're just building that is internal training and really sort of forming new norms, operationalizing those, and then making them a part of everything that we do. One of a good example of that within New York City is the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's Race to Justice. And that's not just environmental justice, though. That is, racial justice and ways of making, really reforming that agency. We have within the Mayor's Office of Resiliency formed our own core equity team for our much smaller office of 30 people, but we're grappling with the very same things using the GARE framework, normalize, formalize, and operationalize. But that's just a whole another level of this work that, in addition to the kinds of things that Grant and Carl touched on, that I think is really, really important.
Great. Well, we're looking at the clock and I feel like we could talk for hours, but I think we're going to try and kind of wrap up with some final thoughts, if that is possible. I mean, you guys have already all provided so much interesting information and food for thought for our city. Closing thoughts that, you know, maybe we could focus on are what other tidbits of advice would you have for our city, kind of taking into account where we are in this overall planning process. So Salim walked us through his slide earlier, you know, showing that we're kind of transitioning to a broader citywide resilience strategy right now. And we have a roadmap planning process underway, but a lot of work to do around, you know, engagement and building capacity within city government, within our communities. And the list really goes on. So I just want to put out the question to everyone: what advice, you know, would you pass along to us, knowing what point we're at in this climate resilience journey? And I'll open the floor up to anyone. And I just, you know, keeping note of time again, we have 10 minutes. So I guess answers hopefully can be just briefly stated so that we can get as many perspectives and nuggets of advice as possible.
I'll give three quick ones. One is you have a friend in Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
So we're here for you guys because we pilfer from you all the time. So I think that's a big piece of just that cross-state collaboration, is that we have a lot of things that we share. Second is always keep in mind the aspects of co-benefits. I mean, we talked a little bit about with kind of the racial justice and equity component, but every project has co-benefits or the ability to achieve a resilience dividend, and teaching people that is really important. And then just personally, Salim, you know, there's a network of chief resilience officers out there now that have been through kind of these trials and tribulations, and you know, you're a part of that network, and just, you know, happy to help facilitate and make connections for you. Some of the best lessons that you'll learn, and Carl will kind of attest to this, and I'm sure Adam as well, that the people that you meet that have gone through the process will definitely share with you where the pitfalls are, so that you don't step in the same ones, and hopefully try to avoid them. And they're always looking to learn from you too. So there's a mutuality there. So we're there for you, man.
So complementing and building on both of the things that Grant just said, I would say don't just think co-benefits. Think about, you know, quantifying those externalities that you can account for, right? And do that both on the positive and negative side, right? So people will come to you with solutions that look great on your economic balance sheet, but that environmental impact, that community benefit or impact, that social impact, you need to put numbers to that and make sure that those numbers are also in the game as part of a pro and a con. And then the other piece is, you know, you've certainly got friends across Pennsylvania, but you're going to run up against a lot of people who said, oh, we looked at that. We considered that already. It didn't work when we looked at it 5 years ago, 2 years ago. And I would say, look again, because the numbers have changed, the technology is changing, the approaches are changing, and it is worth a second look. Don't let your misconceptions or somebody else's misconceptions stand in your way.
Well, it's rare I get to give advice to a city official, but my observations are you want to build coalitions, you know, within the city of, like I said, the infrastructure providers, because they're really important, and they have resources to spend on adaptation because they have revenue streams. The other thing is you want to like bring in all the parties. You want to bring the private developers with the, you know, with the citizens, with the NGOs, the landowners, particularly the developers, because at least in Boston, it's my perception they really control the land use. And so if you're going to do effective adaptation, you've got to bring the development community in. And I think Boston's been lucky because we've had the GRC, and, you know, I can have, you know, all sorts of conversations with developers. So I think I think coalition building is really important. So I always try to do that as part of my work. And also the other thing is, as you pointed out, there's a lot of knowledge out there already. And so you shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. Try to tap into what's already out there. And also take full advantage of the universities there. They're eager to work with you.
Yeah, so if I may say, first of all, Paul, I don't know what you're talking about. You've been giving me advice for years. So, but, you know, to my new friends in Philadelphia, yes, absolutely. Please take advantage of the networks and you know, and our willingness to share. I would say to you, you know, don't wait to have the perfect plan. You know, as people have said, we're learning new things all the time, and I think I've learned a new phrase from Bill about what I think he called it non-stationary situations, and so things are going to keep changing. Our knowledge is going to keep changing, but that shouldn't stop you from taking action when it makes sense. There's plenty to do without knowing exactly where we're going to end up in 25, 50, or 100 years. And, you know, and as Paul Kirshen has been telling me for years, you know, be flexible and adaptable, both in the changes that you make in, you know, physical and social infrastructure and in yourselves as you move forward in your work.
Well, go ahead, Bill.
No, you go ahead. It's for you.
Oh, well, I was going to say, obviously, we also are really excited about the prospect of working together with our friends from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Boston. We are connected in the Northeast through transportation systems, through our work. I think it just makes so much sense on so many levels to continue learning from each other, and we really look forward to that. I would love to see just a couple of, you know, like, for example, one of the next, I think, frontiers of our work is to start to formulate adaptation and mitigation scenarios, sort of citywide or metro area specific scenarios that then we can use to interrogate climate models and figure out, sort of ask if-then questions. But I imagine that that's going to actually be work that, whether it starts out this way or ends up this way, has to be connected to what all of you were thinking about in the way of adaptation and mitigation options. And so that we can really get sort of more realistic and more down to earth about sort of what are the feasible options. I think everybody said so many great things. I hesitate to offer advice, except, you know, the process is more important than the product.
Yeah, actually, that's sort of where I was going to pick up in a way, because I think, you know, the challenge that you'll find, and probably you've already kind of come across it, it's sort of been reflected in some of the things we've heard today, are these tensions between the different spheres and how you guys are going to manage them. I don't have specific recommendations. I think every city is going to have to, I know, has grappled with this, but like the difference between the formal and the informal. Like, you know, do you want to make it more formal? Do you want to leave it as informal? What sort of works for you with respect to, you know, the processes that you're thinking about? Also, like, you know, what goes on within the meetings, you know, the public meetings, how knowledge is conveyed, but also what goes behind the scenes in terms of how the broader spectrum of knowledge that's available is managed and organized, and then sort of decisions are made as to what to bring out. So there's a lot of like inside outside stuff that needs to be, you know, in all the city practitioners, I think, deal with this all the time, but it's something I feel is particularly profound in this space. The last thing I'll say, you know, I mean, it is so much the time to engage with universities. I mean, you know, there's ebbs and flows, but the people, young people in their 20s, they see a world that needs help. They see a world that needs change, and they are absolutely excited to roll up their sleeves. You know, I think one of the things that's a challenge for all of us, both academics and practitioners, is to figure out the right envelopes to sort of, you know, give them the knowledge, but also let them execute the work that they want to do in sustained long-term engagements. And those frames are still in the process of being developed, and maybe Philadelphia could be the chamber where those things are hatched. I think there's a lot of good stuff already happening in that direction.
Well, there could be no better way to close out. I want to thank all of you for your support in this process. I look forward to continuing to work with you, and the dialogue will continue. I'll pass it over to Corinna to close us out.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate everybody on this panel. I love the camaraderie that was shown. I'm really excited for us at Drexel and at the Academy to be part of this journey with you. Normally Franco would close us out, but he had to go off to teach. So I'll just close by saying thank you again to our panelists. We'll have another seminar on November 4th, our next CC Run seminar. We're going to be looking to what some of our smaller cities have been up to in this climate resilience journey, starting with Newark, New Jersey. So you can join us on November 4th for that. Thank you again to everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks.